Jack and Emily stood at the entrance of the haunted house in Salem, Massachusetts. The chilly October air clung to them as they gazed at the towering mansion, its dark wooden exterior shrouded in eerie silence, broken only by the distant whispers of the wind. The flickering lanterns hanging near the entrance cast dancing shadows on the worn-out porch, their light barely cutting through the thick fog that swirled at their feet. The house was elaborately decorated with fake cobwebs, carved jack-o'-lanterns with menacing grins, and hanging skeletons that creaked eerily with each gust of wind. The attraction was packed with tourists, but Jack and Emily had been waiting for this moment. It wasn't just a regular haunted house, this place had a reputation. Locals whispered that the house had seen real horrors, and though most dismissed it as part of the attraction's marketing gimmick, Jack couldn't shake the uneasy feeling growing in his chest. "We'll be fine," Emily said with a teasing smile, nudging him. "It's just for fun." Jack returned the smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. He wasn't so sure anymore. Something about the house felt wrong, and yet, the thrill of Halloween night kept them moving forward. The front doors creaked open as if inviting them inside, and they stepped across the threshold into the dimly lit entryway. The interior of the house was designed to unnerve. The walls were lined with old, cracked mirrors reflecting distorted versions of Jack and Emily as they moved deeper into the maze-like structure. Each room they entered was more unsettling than the last, mysterious whispers echoed through the hallways, and strange drafts of cold air brushed their skin. After passing through a room filled with life-sized mannequins dressed in period clothing, they reached the centerpiece of the attraction, the House of Mirrors. The room was lined with tall mirrors that stretched from the floor to the ceiling, creating a dizzying maze of reflections. It was the final test of the haunted house. Getting out wasn't as simple as it seemed. Emily laughed nervously as they stepped inside, her reflection appearing again and again from different angles, creating the illusion of endless copies of themselves. Jack's heart raced as they began walking through the mirrors. Every time they turned, it seemed as though their reflections lingered just a second too long, moving a fraction slower than they did. At first, it was just a creepy illusion. But then Jack noticed something that made his skin crawl. One of his reflections wasn't mirroring him at all. It stood perfectly still, staring back at him with lifeless eyes. "Emily, wait!" Jack called out, his voice trembling. She had moved ahead, her laughter fading into the twisting hall of mirrors. When he looked back at the reflection, it was gone. His breath caught in his throat as he realized they weren't alone in this maze. Jack's pulse quickened as he pushed deeper into the maze of mirrors, his reflection multiplying and distorting with every step. His breathing was shallow, his eyes darting between the countless versions of himself and Emily that surrounded him. Every now and then, a flicker of movement in one of the mirrors made his heart leap, but when he turned, nothing was there, just the endless reflections. Suddenly, Jack saw something that made his blood run cold. In the farthest mirror, amidst all the distorted reflections, was a figure, a tall, dark silhouette that wasn't either of them. It stood perfectly still, watching him. Its face was hidden in shadow, and yet Jack could feel its gaze piercing through him. He tried to call out to Emily again, but his voice felt weak and distant in the oppressive silence. His hands trembled as he took a step closer to the figure, trying to understand what he was seeing. But with every step he took, the figure seemed to grow closer to him, not through the mirrors, but as though it was physically moving toward him, between the reflections, blending in with the shadows. Panic surged through him, and he bolted in the opposite direction, desperately weaving through the mirrors. The reflections around him seemed to close in, warping and twisting as if they were mocking him. He stumbled, barely catching himself, and when he looked up again, the figure was gone. But the unsettling feeling in his chest remained. Jack's breath came in ragged gasps as he finally caught sight of Emily just ahead, her figure standing still. Relieved, he rushed toward her, only to stop dead in his tracks. She wasn't moving. In fact, she wasn't even breathing. Emily's reflection stood in front of him, her eyes vacant, her face expressionless. But Jack quickly realized it wasn't a reflection at all. It was her, but something was deeply wrong. The real Emily was nowhere to be seen. Jack stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what was happening. The figure of Emily in front of him, or what appeared to be her, slowly turned to face him. Her eyes, once full of life, were now hollow and distant, like the reflection of a person long gone. Her lips curled into a twisted smile that sent a chill down Jack's spine. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Emily?" She didn't respond. Instead, the room around them began to shift. The mirrors, once showing twisted reflections, now seemed to ripple as if the glass was turning into liquid. The dark figure that Jack had seen before was no longer hiding in the mirrors. It stood behind Emily, tall and looming, its hand resting on her shoulder as if claiming her. Jack's legs felt like lead, his body refusing to move. The figure stepped forward, its face still hidden in shadow, but its presence was overwhelming. The air grew colder with every step it took, and the walls seemed to close in around them. Jack finally managed to take a step back, but it was too late. The figure raised its hand, pointing directly at him, and the mirrors around them shattered with a deafening crash. Shards of glass flew everywhere, and Jack shielded his face, stumbling backward as he tried to escape the chaos. When he looked up again, Emily was gone, along with the dark figure. The once elaborate maze of mirrors was now a fragmented ruin, with jagged pieces of glass littering the floor. Jack was alone in the room, the only sound being his own ragged breathing. The exit was nowhere to be found, and the eerie glow from before had faded into total darkness. For a moment, Jack considered the possibility that he might never escape. The haunted house was no longer an attraction, it had become something far more sinister, something real. He closed his eyes, willing himself to wake up from the nightmare, but when he opened them again, the reflection staring back at him wasn't his own. It was the dark figure, now standing in his place, grinning with satisfaction. It was Halloween night, and the streets were filled with kids in costumes, houses glowing with jack-o'-lanterns, and the faint smell of burning wood drifting through the cool autumn air. Jason, a tired father, drove home from his late shift, his headlights slicing through the misty rain that had begun to fall. The windshield wipers moved rhythmically, the sound of rain against the glass almost hypnotic as he turned onto a quiet residential street. As he drove, Jason spotted a figure walking on the side of the road, drenched by the rain. It was a girl, no older than 15 or 16, with no umbrella or jacket, just her thin frame huddled against the cold. He slowed down, his compassionate side getting the better of him. What was she doing out here so late, and in this weather? He pulled over and rolled down the window, rain splashing onto his arm as he called out to her. "Hey, do you need a ride?" The girl stopped walking and looked at him with wide, vacant eyes. Without saying a word, she opened the back door and got into the car, her wet hair sticking to her pale face. Jason shivered as the cold air rushed in, and he quickly turned up the heat. "Where are you headed?" he asked, trying to sound casual. She finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just down to the end of this road." Jason glanced at the end of the street. There wasn't much there, just a dead end and a cemetery beyond that. But he shrugged, thinking she might live nearby. The ride was silent. The girl sat in the back seat, unmoving, her face turned toward the window, staring at the rain-soaked streets. Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air inside the car felt heavier, colder than it should have been. As Jason continued driving, the sound of the rain and the steady hum of the engine filled the car. The girl remained silent in the back seat, her presence growing more unsettling by the second. Jason couldn't help but glance at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her face was expressionless, eyes still locked on the window, as if the world outside fascinated her in some distant way. He cleared his throat, trying to ease the growing tension. "So, you live around here?" he asked. The girl didn't respond. Instead, her eyes shifted slightly, as if she didn't hear him at all. Jason's fingers tightened on the steering wheel, the eerie silence weighing down on him. As they approached the final stop sign at the dead end, Jason asked again, "Is it past the dead end? The cemetery?" Still, no answer. But when he looked in a rearview mirror, his heart nearly stopped. The back seat was empty. Jason slammed the brakes, his heart pounding in his chest as he whipped around to look at the seat. There was no one there. The door hadn't opened. He hadn't heard any movement. She was simply gone. His breathing quickened as panic set in. He jumped out of the car, the rain soaking him instantly. He circled the car, checking the back seat, the street, the nearby sidewalk. But there was no sign of the girl. It was as if she had disappeared into thin air. Then, as he looked toward the dead end, something caught his eye. Beyond the wrought iron fence that surrounded the cemetery, a single grave stood illuminated by a flickering streetlight. His mind raced, and he remembered the girl's words, "Just down to the end of this road." Jason's stomach turned as realization set in. He wasn't imagining things. She had been there, hadn't she? Jason stood frozen in the pouring rain, staring at the grave illuminated by the flickering streetlight. His mind raced, his pulse pounding in his ears. It didn't make sense. How could the girl have vanished without a trace? He had just been speaking to her moments ago. Now, she was gone, and all that remained was the eerie silence of the cemetery at the end of the road. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he slowly walked toward the cemetery gates, his feet splashing in the growing puddles. He wasn't sure why he was approaching the grave, but something deep inside urged him forward, as if the answers he sought were just beyond the rusted iron fence. As Jason reached the gate, he hesitated, staring at the gravestone. The name carved into it sent a shiver down his spine: Allison Carter, 1998 to 2014. His breath caught in his throat. He had just spoken to a girl named Ally. Could it be a coincidence? With trembling hands, Jason pulled out his phone and quickly searched for the name. What he found made his stomach turn. Allison Carter had died in a car accident on this very road 10 years ago. The article showed a picture of her, a familiar face, the same face that had sat in the back of his car. Jason stumbled back, his phone slipping from his hands into the wet grass. His mind reeled as he tried to piece everything together. She wasn't real, she couldn't be. But then, who had been in his car? His heart raced, and he turned to leave, but something stopped him. The rain seemed to slow, and the world around him grew eerily still. He could feel a presence, a coldness that sent chills through his body. Slowly, he looked back at the grave, his eyes widening in horror. Standing just beyond the iron fence, partially obscured by the fog, was the figure of the girl, Allison Carter. She stood motionless, her pale face gazing at him with sad, vacant eyes. The rain dripped down her ghostly figure, yet her clothes were dry, untouched by the storm. Jason's legs felt like lead as he stood rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to look away. The girl raised her hand slowly, pointing toward him, her mouth barely moving as she whispered, "Thank you for the ride." And then, as quickly as she had appeared, she vanished into the mist. Jason's mind was spinning. His heart raced as he stood before the gravestone, now bathed in the flickering light of the street lamp. The cemetery around him was silent, save for the sound of rain pattering softly on the ground. Allison's ghostly figure had vanished into the mist, leaving Jason alone in the cold, dark night. He stumbled back toward his car, every nerve in his body screaming for him to leave, but his feet felt heavy, as if the weight of what had just happened was physically pulling him down. His hands shook as he fumbled with the car door, finally pulling it open and collapsing into the driver's seat. For a moment, he just sat there, breathing heavily, trying to convince himself that it was over, that he had imagined everything. But the truth was too overwhelming to ignore. He had given a ride to a ghost, a girl who had been dead for a decade. And yet, she had spoken to him, looked him in the eye, and whispered her thanks before disappearing. Jason's phone buzzed, startling him out of his thoughts. He looked down to see a notification from the local news app. The headline read, "Remembering Allison Carter, a local tragedy 10 years later." He clicked on the article, and there, staring back at him, was the same picture of the girl he had just seen at the cemetery. His blood ran cold as he read through the article, learning more about the tragic accident that had taken Allison's life. The road she had been walking down the night of her death was the very one he had picked her up on. She had been hit by a drunk driver, just trying to make her way home after Halloween festivities. Her final resting place, this very cemetery. Jason closed the app, his hands trembling as he put the phone down. His mind was overwhelmed with questions, but one thing was clear: Allison had been reaching out to him, and somehow, he had given her the ride she never got all those years ago. With a heavy sigh, Jason turned the ignition, the car's engine rumbling to life. He glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, half expecting to see her sitting there once more. But the back seat was empty. As he pulled away from the cemetery, the rain began to slow, and the mist started to lift. But no matter how far he drove, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that he had been part of something far beyond his understanding, something otherworldly, tragic, and deeply unsettling. And though the girl was gone, he knew he'd never forget her face, or her whispered words, "Thank you for the ride." The cool October night was perfect for a Halloween scare, and Joe, Carl, Cody, and I were ready for it. We had been to a haunted house every year, but this time we wanted something different. Oak Hill, Ohio, had the best reputation for its haunted corn maze, and we had been hearing about it for years. Tonight, we were going to experience it for ourselves. As we approached the entrance, the air smelled of damp earth and freshly harvested corn. The maze stood tall, the cornstalks towering over us, swaying gently in the breeze. It was pitch dark, except for the occasional flicker of lights from the lanterns that marked the pathway into the maze. The laughter and screams of other visitors echoed in the distance, adding to the eerie ambience. The entrance was adorned with fake cobwebs, a sign reading, "Enter if you dare," and an animatronic scarecrow that moved slightly when we passed by. We grinned at each other, the thrill of fear already starting to creep in. "We're definitely splitting up at some point, right?" Cody said, grinning mischievously. The maze had different paths, and one of them was rumored to be far more terrifying than the others. I nodded. 2 and 2? We stepped through the entrance, the walls of corn closing in around us. It wasn't long before the flickering lanterns behind us disappeared, and the only light came from the dim glow of the moon, barely visible through the overcast sky. Every rustle in the corn seemed louder than it should, every shadow more ominous. But we laughed it off, it was all part of the experience. That was until we reached the fork in the maze. There, a sign stood, one arrow pointing left with the words "This way to safety," and another pointing right with the ominous warning, "Danger, keep out." "Well, you know which one we're taking," Cody said with a grin, heading toward the right. Cody and I ventured down the right path, leaving Joe and Carl behind. The air seemed to grow colder, and the sounds of the other visitors faded away until it was just the two of us and the rustling corn. The occasional screech from a hidden speaker or the flutter of a plastic bat kept us on edge, but we kept moving, eager for whatever scare awaited us. Then, as we turned a corner, we saw him, a man standing in the middle of the path. He was tall and dressed in all black, his face hidden behind a plain white mask with 2 hollow eye holes. In his hands, he held a large pumpkin, perfectly round and glowing faintly in the moonlight. Cody and I exchanged a glance, half expecting him to jump out or scream. but the man just stood there, staring at us through his mask. His presence was unnerving, but we laughed it off. It was just another part of the maze, right? He took a step toward us, raising the pumpkin slightly. "Take it," he said, his voice low and raspy, like it hadn't been used in years. We hesitated. The maze was supposed to be fun, but something about this man felt off. Cody chuckled nervously, trying to shake the unease. "Nah, we're good," he said, stepping around the man. But the man followed, his voice growing more insistent. "Take it." I felt a chill run down my spine. The way he moved, the way he spoke, it was too real. "Let's just go," I whispered to Cody, but the man kept pace with us, his masked face never turning away. "Take it," he repeated, his voice now tinged with anger. "Or I'll make you take it." Cody and I quickened our pace, trying to shake the man, but his footsteps followed close behind. The sound of his boots crunching on the dirt path echoed in the silence of the corn maze, growing louder with every step. My heart raced as I glanced over my shoulder. He was still there, holding the pumpkin out in front of him like some twisted offering. "Just take it," Cody shouted back at him, trying to diffuse the tension. But the man's mask never wavered, his hollow eyes boring into us. Finally, I stopped. The feeling of dread had taken root, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I turned to face the man, my voice shaking as I said, "What do you want?" The man paused, his hand still gripping the pumpkin. His head tilted slightly, and for a moment, the only sound was the rustling of the corn around us. Then, in a voice low and filled with malice, he said, "Take it. Or I'll kill you." My blood ran cold. This wasn't part of the attraction. Cody and I exchanged horrified glances. Was this guy serious? We didn't wait to find out. Without another word, we bolted down the path, our feet pounding against the ground as we raced through the maze, twisting and turning blindly. The corn blurred around us, and the man's footsteps seemed to follow, relentless and terrifying. I didn't dare look back. All I could hear was the pounding of my heart and the rustling of the corn as we ran deeper into the maze, hoping to find a way out. Cody and I ran until we couldn't hear the footsteps anymore, our lungs burning, and our legs aching. We finally slowed to a stop, gasping for breath, surrounded by the towering walls of corn. The maze had grown unnervingly quiet, and the eerie calm that followed only made the fear settle deeper into my bones. "I think we lost him," Cody panted, his eyes wide with terror. But something still didn't feel right. I glanced around, trying to get my bearings, but every direction looked the same. Just endless rows of corn, twisting paths, and shadows that seemed to move on their own. Suddenly, we heard a rustling sound, but this time, it wasn't the wind. It was coming from directly ahead of us. We froze, our hearts pounding in our chests. Out of the shadows emerged Joe and Carl, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. "Where the hell have you guys been?" Carl asked, his voice shaky. "We've been looking for you." Before we could answer, Joe pointed to something in my hands. I looked down, and my blood ran cold. I was holding the pumpkin. I stammered, dropping it instantly as if it had burned me. My mind raced, trying to understand how it had ended up in my hands. I didn't remember picking it up. I didn't even remember stopping to grab anything. But there it was, the same pumpkin the masked man had offered us. Suddenly, the air around us seemed to grow heavier, and the corn behind us began to rustle again. Cody, Joe, Carl, and I turned in unison, our hearts sinking as the masked man appeared once more, slowly stepping out from the shadows, his hollow eyes fixed on the pumpkin at my feet. He didn't speak this time. He didn't need to. The message was clear, we had taken what he offered, and now we were his. The maze wasn't a game anymore. It was a trap. Thanks for joining us on this terrifying journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more spine-chilling tales. Have your own scary experience? Share it in the comments below. We might just feature it in our next video. And remember, the next scare is only one click away, so be sure to turn on notifications, because it's scary stories to you. The fear never sleeps.